Oh my god. How long have I been speaking with no audio? No, there's sound now, because I saw the button I had to push. Good God. Well, since apparently I've been talking to nobody for the past, I don't want to think about how many minutes. Hello everyone. I am indeed your magnanimous and extraordinarily good-looking host, President Sunday. I know, control yourselves. This stream is obviously called the Nomos of Woo, and we're going to be looking at a very specific, very famous, and rare piece of woo called the Human History Movie by the channel Spirit Science, whose host, Jordan Duknich, I feel obligated to repeat at every mention of his name, is a disgusting purveyor of lies, as well as a rapist who got off the hook because the state of Oregon does not count coercion as an element of sexual assault. Moving on, however, tonight we are not going to be doing a breakdown of the nonsensicalness of Jordan's work, around which a cottage industry of sorts has formed after Armored Skeptic's classic reviews of the video we are going to be using as our primary source here. But rather, we will be engaging in a nomological analysis of the world that is implied by Jordan's video and its lore. That means we are going to be drawing out its nomos, which is a term you'll be familiar with if you've watched videos on this channel before, but if you're not familiar with it, I take the term nomos from the German political theorist Carl Schmitt's book, The Nomos of the Earth, which I have shown you in absolute silence already once, in which he sums up its meaning as follows, quote, "For us, nomos is a matter of the fundamental process of apportioning space that is essential to every historical epoch. A matter of the structure determining convergence of order and orientation in the cohabitation of peoples on this now scientifically surveyed planet. This is the sense in which the nomos of the earth is spoken of here. Every new age and every new epoch in the coexistence of peoples, empires, and countries, of rulers and power formations of every sort, is founded on new spatial divisions, new enclosures, and new spatial orders of the earth," unquote. And that last section really encompasses the meaning, the part of the meaning that's important here. The spatial order of the earth, that is the nomos. We are trying to determine what is the spatial order of Jordan Duknich's, I have no idea how to pronounce that name, Spirit Science's woo-woo land. So, such as it is, we will be scientifically surveying the world that Jordan presents to us, take account of its parts in a sort of encyclopedia, represented by this window this paint window at the bottom left of the screen here. We will then attempt to reconstruct the order of that world from these elements, and by so doing, determine its nomos, which is again, its spatial structure. In simpler terms, we will be left with a model describing this postulated world about which we can start to make determinations and predictions. Not unlike we can make determinations and predictions in chess based on our understanding of the makeup of the board. I expect this to be a dumpster fire. I think my expectation was satisfied so far, but as Jake from Adventure Time says, sucking at something is the first step to being sort of good at something, so let's begin.
Over the last few thousand years, we have warped our own history. Our stories of the past have been changed, altered, mistranslated, and completely been misunderstood as we rounded the curve on the precession of the equinox. Modern views of our history account for many things, but completely dismiss many very important pieces in the puzzle. For example, the pyramids of Giza. There is no modern theory that accounts for how these could have been made. Individually, each block cannot be pulled even with 50 men pulling it, let alone drag it for hundreds of miles and then stack them on top of each other 450 feet in the air, in such a precise way that even modern technology can't achieve. Not to mention having it lined up precisely with both Orion's belt, a golden mean, and Fibonacci spiral, and be a primary nodal point of every sacred site on the planet.
Alright, so right off the bat, we have our first element, something concrete in the world. A system, a nodal system of sacred sites. And how can we represent a pyramid here without having to draw anything? Yeah, there we go. All right, let's keep going.
And that's just one example. Our history is not what we think. Many things that we've been led to believe to be true simply is not. This has got to be the biggest. The field of archaeology recently saw some monumental discoveries that are rocking the foundation of what we think we know about ourselves. Many ancient cities such as Babylon, Erech, and Akkad that were written about in the Bible and other ancient texts were always thought to be myths because no one could prove they existed.
That's where
Then,
Sargon comes
one of
from.
them was found. This led to finding another, and then another. Inside one of these cities, archaeologists found thousands of cylindrical clay tablets hidden deep within the earth under this ancient city. The tablets were completely covered in text, written in cuneiform, and tell an ancient story that spans back over hundreds of thousands of years on this planet, describing the history of the earth and the origins of the human race in great detail. Now, the first thing we all want to do is just say that they were making things up. They didn't know the history of Earth, and they were simply creating tales to explain where they came from. However, if this was true, how can we explain how they knew so many things about the universe that would seem impossible to know? Not only did the Dogons know all about the distant planets in the solar system, but so did the Sumerians. They described them all in great detail in these Sumerian records. They also knew about the precession of the equinox. That's a tough one for a historian to understand, because it takes over 2,000 years of continuous observation to actually learn that the Earth has a wobble. The Sumerians had this information from day one of their civilization. A man named Zacharias Sitchin spent a long time transcribing these texts and had put them all together in his books, but many others have also done the same, and the interpretations are always very similar. Not only that, but Thoth has also shared information about this with us, and his account matches the Sumerian records. Adamus and other channelings discuss it as well. If you see all of these records and sources, there is a huge connection between the stories. Now, this story spans back hundreds of thousands of years into our past. It talks about Tiamat and Nibiru, the Nephilim, seeding the human race, Adam and Eve, and the children of Lemuria. This portion of the story is really interesting, but not the most crucial to know. We're not going to be covering this at this time. We are, however, going to be picking up the story at the end of Lemuria, and discussing the events of Atlantis up to present day. What I'm going to tell you is a mix of what these records say, along with what Thoth has told us for some finer details. Please have your own experience while watching this. I'm not going to tell you that this is fact. I am simply saying, decide for yourself. There was a time, long ago, when humans existed at a very high level of consciousness. We were interdimensional and were very psychic. We communicated through thought and emotion, much like how animals do rather than speaking or writing, which would seem very primitive. We lived primarily on a large string of islands called Lemuria.
Alright, large string of islands. Humanity confined. Large string of islands. Lemuria.
But there was a consciousness shift. We moved up in consciousness, and the islands of Lemuria sank beneath the oceans.
Okay. Elevation of land tied to consciousness. The location? What are we shifting along? Let's just say consciousness status.
At the time of this shift, a new continent rose out of the waters. We called it Atlantis. Back in the early 1900s, the spiritual path of the United States was similar to what's happening today. People began to learn about meditation and study ancient lands like Atlantis and Lemuria. We actually found quite a bit of evidence that Lemuria existed, and it had to do with coral. See, the ocean floor does rise and fall. Coral can exist up to 150 feet under the surface of the water. In 1910, the surface of the ocean was probably higher because they were able to see coral rings heading away from Easter Islands for a great distance. These rings were estimated to be found at 1,800 feet, which means that for them to have existed, they would have had to be much higher and sunk slowly. Probably more important, they also found the exact same fauna and flora from the Hawaiian Islands all the way to the Easter Islands. This is a great distance, but if you look at a map, you'll see a long string. That string, according to Thoth, used to run along the western shores of Lemuria. It is only on these islands that have the same flora and fauna. Same trees, bugs, bacteria, everything. Science can only explain this if there were closer land bridges between these islands at one point. Although we were studying this at that time, World War I began soon after, and we lost interest in spirituality and the ancient lands for a very long time. After the sinking of Lemuria and the rising of Atlantis, at first the human race became scattered. We moved to various islands and continents all over the world because we didn't have a home.
Alright, so we are not confined to a large string of islands. We are dispersed. Okay, so that's a little curious. Alright, so elevation of land tied to consciousness levels, we'll say. That's kind of presuming some things I don't want to presume. Like, for example, that these things are sort of elevating and descending, but I think it's probably giving Jordan a little bit too much credit. I think there's something a bit more nuanced going on here. Humanity confined to a large string of islands called Lemuria spreads over the Earth. Atlantis rises, and this matters for some reason.
Yet, we didn't know where to go. At that time, there were about 1,000 humans at a very high consciousness, more than all of the rest. They were called the Nakals. Today, we know them as Ascended Masters. The Nakals began preparing Atlantis to be our new home. They projected their energies across the surface of the continent in the form of the Tree of Life, not with 10 circles, but with 12, an extra on top on the island of Udal, and an extra on the bottom in the water. There were 10 components on the mainland, and even though it extended over hundreds of miles on the surface, it was projected to the accuracy of a single atom. We chose to move to Atlantis because of the Kundalini. In humans, the Kundalini is often referred to as the energy serpent that runs up and down your spine. When activated, it provides an immense amount of energy through all of the chakras. The Earth itself also has a Kundalini because the Earth is alive, like an organism, running from the center of the planet to a specific place on the surface.
Alright, and the Earth has a Kundalini, apparently. So I take it this is to account for the strangeness with respect to the relationship between land and consciousness. Kundalini, I'm assuming that's how you spell it. Kundalini and planets. And where are we?
Wherever the Kundalini resides, the people there become the spiritual leaders of the world. The Earth chose Atlantis to be the new energetic center of the planet. After Atlantis, the Kundalini moved to the mountains of Tibet, which is why the Buddhists were the leaders in pure spirituality for the last 13,000 years.
Alright, so this Kundalini is oriented towards specific places on the Earth's surface. And I'm assuming that this is connected to the nodal system of sacred sites noted here above. Let's sort of link these. And it has limits. It selects one site at a time to, I guess, focus on. To channel its energies towards. That'll stick.
It was a very pure place. It moved again within the last 10 years, but that's a story for another time. If you want to read more, check out the book The Serpent of Light by Drunvalo Melchizedek. Suddenly, in a single day, the Nakals breathed life into the Tree of Life on the surface of Atlantis. This created vortexes of energy rotating out of each and every circle. Once the vortexes were established, the children of Lemuria began to be called forth. Millions upon millions of Lemurians who had settled all across the planet began to be pulled toward Atlantis. A great migration began. However, the Lemurian body of consciousness had only reached the age of 12 as a planetary consciousness. Because we were right-brained, we were a female species, like a 12-year-old girl. And some of our centers weren't working yet. They had worked with these energies, but only mastered 8 of the 10. Each migrating Lemurian was attracted to one of these 8 centers on Atlantis, depending on the nature of the individual. There, they settled and began to build cities. That left 2 vortexes with nobody using them, not a single person. These 2 vortexes were pulling life toward them, and in life, you can't have an empty place. Life will find a way to fill it. Similar to if you were driving along a freeway, following another car, and you drop too far behind, someone will fill the place. That's exactly what happened on Atlantis. Though the Lemurians had only filled 8 of the vortex areas, Mayan records state clearly that there were 10 cities in Atlantis when it fell. You can see these records in the Troano document, which is now located in the British Museum. This document is estimated to be 3,500 years old, and it describes in detail the sinking of Atlantis. To fill these 2 empty vortexes, according to Thoth, 2 extraterrestrial races stepped in.
Okay, so this is actually very interesting. So we have an apparent pull so that permanent dwellings are established only on these vortex nodes. So we have a nodal system of, okay, so first of all, humanity pulls again, only this time on Atlantis. And this is why Atlantis matters. And on Atlantis is a system of 10 vortices? Is that the plural? We'll say vortices. Someone can correct me in the chat if I'm saying that wrong. The noodle system is a system of 10 vortices which pull humans to settle and build cities, but actually not humans, and pulls, let's say, rational animals to settle and build cities. And it even pulls rational animals from off planet. And now we're going to have an additional element here. We're going to have 2 extraterrestrial species. Oh, let's lower that a little bit. Humans fail to settle all 10. And apparently just the Kundalini spirit or whatever, or life, what has you, it requires these nodes to be filled for some reason, so it will pull specifically rational animals from anywhere to build cities there. Making sense? Okay. Let's zoom out a little bit. Let's make that a little bigger. There we go. We're going to need lots of space in this encyclopedia. And let's keep going.
Not one, but 2 completely different races. The first race were the Hebrews, coming from our future. Thoth says that they came from off-planet, but we don't know where exactly. The Hebrews were kind of like a kid who went through 5th grade and didn't make it, so they had to do that grade over again. They learned all the math, the left brain stuff, but they didn't get the right brain aspect of evolving consciousness, the doing. They didn't graduate to the next level of evolution, so they had to do it again. They knew a lot of things that we didn't know yet and brought many concepts and ideas to us that we weren't aware of yet. Now, if this is true, this would explain quite a few things about the Hebrew people in general. They seem to have many sacred geometries hidden within their culture. It also puts perspective on the story of Exodus. Perhaps Moses incarnated into that lifetime to free the Hebrews because they were not direct descendants of humans and were being treated unfairly.
Alright, so the first of which, I forgot how weird this got. Time-traveling space Jews. Let's say Hebrews. And I guess we should put that there. Just to stay professional. Optics matter here.
Or could it be that Moses was visited by an ascended master of the Hebrews who guided him to free their people? Given what we know about dimensions and consciousness, it definitely puts a fresh perspective on old stories that didn't make much sense. We could talk about this more, but let's continue for now. There were no problems caused by the Hebrews coming to Atlantis. They actually benefited our evolution. The other race that stepped in caused big problems. These beings came from the nearby planet of Mars. See, according to Thoth, Mars looked very much like Earth a little less than 1 million years ago. It was beautiful. It had oceans and water and trees that were just fantastic. But something happened to them, and it has to do with something called the Lucifer experiment.
Alright, and now we have the Martians, who are obviously going to be in red, because why not?
From the very beginning of creation, everything is simply an experiment. Creation itself was just consciousness creating and inhabiting itself in that creation. There is no divine plan. Spirit can do whatever it wants. Having said that, if Spirit decides to cut itself off from the rest of consciousness and create a separate reality on its own, it can do that too. This is called the Lucifer experiment.
Okay, so now we have introduced something really interesting. We can have alternate realities. So, let's go in purple here, but Spirit can cut. Well, what do we want to say here? Let's rewind this quickly. I want to see the actual language here.
The Lucifer experiment. From the very beginning of creation, everything is simply an experiment. Creation itself was just consciousness creating and inhabiting itself in that creation. There is no divine plan. Spirit can do whatever it wants. Having said that, if Spirit decides to cut itself off from the...
Okay, so this is like a weird butchery of something sort of superficially resembling Hegel. Okay, but apparently, Spirit, whatever this is in this context, can divide the universe and create new worlds.
the rest of consciousness and create a separate reality on its own, it can do that too. This is called the Lucifer experiment. Because Spirit is God, it can do this. There is nothing wrong with that. We've kind of been led to believe that Lucifer is evil and the devil. This just isn't true. Lucifer is just another means of perceiving the reality. It is not a unity perception of oneness, but rather a duality perception of two-ness. There's a flower of life pattern for Lucifer as well, but that's a big topic for another time. Anytime the Lucifer experiment has been attempted in the universe, it always ends in failure. The species will cut itself off from love and will become incredibly male, left-brained. What always ends up happening is that everyone becomes very greedy. There is no compassion for one another, and everyone ends up fighting until they end up killing themselves. More than 1 million years ago, the beings on Mars joined the Lucifer experiment, and it failed dramatically. Basically, they cut themselves off from the unity of the universe and created a separate reality. When the Martians severed the love bond, they became pure male, logical beings with no emotions. What happened on Mars was that they ended up fighting. Mars became a battleground. Eventually, it became clear that Mars was not going to survive. They blew their atmosphere away and destroyed the surface of the planet. Nova recently did an episode on planetary magnetics, and they found some interesting things about Mars. The planet didn't have a magnetic system, however the surface was magnetized, implying that at one point it did, but that something happened. Now,
okay, so apparently maleness is like the flood. If a planet becomes too male, we all die.
we've been discussing the star tetrahedron before, and now I want to give you a brief understanding of the Merkaba. The Merkaba was known in ancient times as the Chariot of Ascension. It is the star tetrahedral energy field around the body. All around the world, there are references to this in ancient texts. When activated to its full potential, the Merkaba, which is both a tool and part of your being, can be used to do the impossible, included but not limited to changing dimensions and traveling through the universe. Before Mars was destroyed, they built huge tetrahedral pyramids. They built 3, 4, and 5-sided pyramids, eventually building a complex that was able to build a synthetic Merkaba. After 1 million years or so, it's been eroded, but the proof is there. Now, because the Martians were severed from the Unity consciousness, they couldn't create a living Merkaba. They simply used it as a tool. They created a synthetic Merkaba to travel in time and find a new home. A small group of Martians tried to get away from Mars before it was destroyed, and that place they found was Earth. About 65,000 years in our past. They saw this little vortex sitting there, just pulling in life, with no one in it. They didn't ask permission. Being part of the Lucifer experiment, they just said, alright, let's do it. And they stepped onto that vortex, and in doing so, they joined and changed our evolutionary path.
Okay, so a new dimension to this. Not only do we have multiple universes, but we can use a Merkaba to invade other ones. Oh, and you know what? As luck would have it, even this low technology of paint has... Oh, no wait, that's not it. There we go. Haha. Excellent. Alright. We can use a Merkaba. Am I spelling that right? Am I spelling that right? It's important to me that I spell these made-up words right. Except I know Merkaba's not. It's from something else. Which I don't know because I'm not that much of a joke. Not that much of a nerd. There is an H. Alright. That is that. I'm glad we got that spelled correctly. That's important. To invade Worlds cut off by spirit? Slash Kundalini, slash life, slash God. I guess those words don't really mean anything, but we'll just go with that.
As a tool, they created a synthetic Merkaba to travel in time and find a new home. A small represented the regular people of Atlantis. We'll come back to this down the road. There were only a few thousand Martians who came to Earth through the synthetic Merkaba. The first thing they did when they arrived in Atlantis was try to take over the continent. They tried to declare war and invade. However, they were vulnerable due to their small numbers, compared to the millions of Atlanteans, and we finally subdued them. We were able to stop them from conquering us, but we could not send them back. When this happened on our evolutionary path, we now had the planetary consciousness of a 14-year-old girl. The Martians were an incredibly male species, and also very old, so what you had was a 14-year-old girl being taken over by a 60 or 70-year-old man. We had no choice in the matter. The Martians just stepped in and said, like it or not, we're here. They didn't care what we thought or felt about it.
It's important for this that we have an anatomical representation of the Martians. It's very, very important that we do this. This is for science. This is how we do political science in the academy, people.
Really, it was no different from what the settlers of North America did to the Native Americans. Once the initial conflict was over, it was agreed that the Martians would try and understand this female thing they lacked. This emotional feeling, which they had none of at all. Things more or less settled for a while, but the Martians slowly began to implement their left-brain technologies, which the Atlanteans knew nothing about. One after the other, the Martians kept putting out these left-brain inventions, until the Atlanteans slowly began to see things through their left brain. We slowly began to become a male species. The Martians gained control, bit by bit, until eventually they had all of the power, as was their intention. The animosity between Atlanteans and the Martians never subsided, not even till the end of Atlantis. They hated each other. The Atlanteans were shoved down and treated like inferiors. It was like a marriage that the female component didn't like, but the male component didn't really care if she liked it or not. It remained this way for a very long time, until about 26,000 years ago, when the next phase slowly began.
Okay, so there's a new element here that's very interesting, in fact. Now, this seems like it's inconsistent. The Martians came, we defeated them, and yet they nonetheless gained control of us. However, it appears that simply by being in contact, we infect each other. So these sort of male energies and female energies, or what have you, these are an infectious substance. So again, maleness is basically like the flood. We need to glass the planet. So we will add to here, note, maleness, i.e. left brain thinking, is infectious.
Before we continue, we have to talk about polar shifts. See, in the 1930s, Edgar Cayce was channeling information for a geologist when he stopped and he said, "There's something you should know. In the near future, the Earth's poles are going to shift." Cayce was a brilliant man with a very strong connection to higher dimensions, where he communicated with other beings for the human race. Ultimately, it was because of his channelings that the belief system called New Age was created. This is again just putting what he was doing into boxes of understanding, because no one else understood what he was doing at that time. Nevertheless, when Cayce talked, people listened. Geologists began exploring the possibility of a polar shift, and they found something remarkable. A string of major pieces of evidence came forth and lent tremendous weight to what Cayce was saying, and they have now changed the world's view on the subject. Scientists believed that if there was going to be a physical pole shift, there would also be a change in the magnetic poles. Through studying lava beds, geologists were able to see where the planetary magnetics were when the lava beds hardened at certain depths. They found that the earlier magnetic poles were not where they were now, but in Hawaii. The last shift that took place was 13,000 years ago, and we will get there in the story soon. They did another test and found that it had shifted again 26,000 years ago as well. Scientists also learned that polar shifts happen very quickly. In a single day, the magnetics would do a complete flip, or turn 90 degrees. There's that number again. And within 24 hours, the sun would be rising differently than it did the previous day. This shift has happened hundreds of times over the last 100 million years on Earth, but it's speeding up now and happening faster and faster. Now only 13,000 years between each shift. A whole new viewpoint is beginning to be understood. From space, would this not appear as a pulse? Now, there's a lot more to talk about with polar shifts, but I'm going to give you the basics. A scientist named Charles Hapgood was studying this at great detail because the leading theory behind what caused polar shifts was still underdeveloped at the time. He came up with a theory that demonstrated to be possible through various experiments. Through these experiments, they learned that the surface of the Earth, the crust, could slip over the main mass of the Earth.
Oh, is the sound lost again? Oh dear, that's frustrating. Hang on. Oh, it's this silly microphone. Alright. You didn't miss anything, don't worry.
Whales were continually beaching themselves in the 90s because they followed these magnetics, which led them to land where there should have been water. As for humans, you know how on the night of the full moon there are more rapes, murders, and violent crimes than any other night of the lunar cycle? Well, the moon affects the magnetics of the Earth, slightly. But the magnetics are so warped right now, it's affecting how we think and act as a planet. Our collapse of social structure is related to the geomagnetics of the Earth. Or perhaps it's the other way around. There's one other thing that we need to discuss about polar shifts. They always line up with a consciousness shift. They are interrelated. Thoth lived on Atlantis for a very long time, and he told us that he saw the Earth shift 5 times, watching the sun rise in the east, and then the west, then the east, then the west. This is how to explain why during a consciousness shift at the end of Lemuria, it sank beneath the oceans and Atlantis rose. If the crust was spinning randomly around the planet, many geological events such as continents rising and falling would take place. Now that we have an understanding of polar shifts, we can continue with this drama on Atlantis.
I have no idea what he just said. I have no idea what that even said. I don't think it was relevant. I guess it's the best we can derive for our purposes that it restates this point here. That apparently something to do with the Earth's spiritual energy or something, which I guess is manifest in magnetism or something, is connected to our attitudes somehow, because that's a thing. Geomagnetic poles of the Earth and human consciousness shifts are interrelated. I suppose. I don't know how this is going to be relevant, though. We'll write it down anyways. So not just elevation of land. Oh my god, get lower you. There we go. Yeah. Geomagnetic poles of the Earth. And human consciousness shifts are interrelated somehow. And somehow connected to the elevation of land.
26,000 years ago, we were exactly where we were today on the precession of the equinox. We had gone through our falling asleep phase, and we were about to begin waking up. It was at this point that there was a small consciousness shift. We actually went down in consciousness, not up. A piece of Atlantis about the size of Rhode Island sank into the ocean. This caused a tremendous amount of fear within the Atlanteans, because they thought they were going to lose the whole continent, like what happened with Lemuria. Because of the consciousness shift, one of the bigger things they lost was their connection to the future. They couldn't foresee big events such as the potential sinking of their home. After about 200 years, this fear began to subside. Now, in both the Bible and the Sumerian records, the accounts of Adam, Eve, and all of their children were recorded to have exceptionally long lifespans, like 900 years or so. So 200 years for us back then is like 20 years for us today. We'll explain how we got there soon. Things kinda settled for a while, and then between 13,000 and 16,000 years ago, a comet approached the Earth. Because we were living at a high consciousness across all dimensions, the Atlanteans became aware of it before it hit. A great conflict occurred in Atlantis. The Martians, who were in the minority even though they were in control, wanted to blow it out of the sky with their laser technology. However, the Nacals had learned of the comet's true nature, and the Atlanteans protested. They said that the comet was in divine order. They had to allow it to take place naturally. Let it hit the Earth. That's what's supposed to happen. The Martians fought the Atlanteans, but in the end they gave in. The Martians agreed to let it hit the Earth. When the time arrived, it came screaming into the atmosphere, plunging into the Atlantic Ocean just off to the western shores of Atlantis, near where Charleston, South Carolina is now, only that was at the bottom of the ocean at the time. The remnants of the comet are now scattered across 4 states, and science has definitely determined that it hit at least 12,000 years ago, if not more. They're still finding pieces today. Although the main portion struck near Charleston, a few fragments actually hit the main body of Atlantis, crashing into an area right where the Martians were living, killing a huge portion of their population. They were pissed. They said, "It's all over, we're divorcing you, and we're gonna do whatever we want. You can do what you want, but we will never listen to you again." We know this whole bit. We've seen it in divorced families throughout the world. And the children? Well, look at our modern world today. We are the children. You can guess what the Martians did next. Their primary interface with the reality was control, and when their anger rose to meet their desire for control, they decided to take over the Earth. They began to once again create a complex like the one they built on Mars long ago to try and create another synthetic Merkaba. If they had succeeded, they would have gained control over everything on the planet. The only thing was, around 50,000 Earth years had passed since they had built a Merkaba, and they didn't quite remember how to do it. But they thought they did. The Martians built the buildings in Atlantis. They set up the whole experiment, threw the switch, and lost control. The destruction was immense. In this reality, you can hardly make a greater error than to create an out-of-control Merkaba. The experiment began to rip open the dimensional levels. Not the higher ones, but the lower ones. To give an analogy, if you took a knife and slit open your stomach, the stomach acids would seep into other parts of the body that it's not supposed to be in. That's like ripping open the dimensions. The Martians almost destroyed the Earth. The environmental disaster we are experiencing today is nothing in comparison, though today's disasters are a direct result of these events. Because
Okay, so that's sort of interesting. So the dimensions spill when they're ruptured. And I take dimensions here to be synonymous with universes. This is super systematic, as you can see. We are scientists. I'm a little confused as to why the Martians need to constantly reconquer the Earth once they're already in charge.
because of this tear in the dimensional levels, a huge number of lower dimensional spirits and beings were thrown out of their comfort zone and into these higher levels. They were forced into a world that they did not know or understand. To survive, they needed bodies, and began automatically entering into the bodies of people. For every human body, there were hundreds of lower dimensional spirits inhabiting them. These beings were Earthlings, like us, but very different, not coming from this dimension. It was a catastrophe, probably the biggest the Earth has ever seen. The reason the Nacals were special wasn't just because of their incredibly high consciousness, making them like guides of Atlantis. They also had achieved what today we call immortality. Let's just say they figured out a way to keep their body healthy and young for as long as they chose, and could choose to pass on whenever they desired it. When reincarnating, they do not suffer the great memory loss that we do when we incarnate. They did it through their expanded consciousness and tantric interdimensional sex meditations. This is how Thoth was a priest king of Atlantis for thousands of years and stayed on Earth until 15 years ago when he gave all of his memories and understanding about sacred geometry to a man named Drunvalo Melchizedek. The Merkaba is formed out of 3 star tetrahedrons overlaid on top of each other. 2 of them are counter-rotating and the third is stationary. When the Merkaba is formed with the unity consciousness, it is formed internally with love. When it is formed externally through the Lucifer experiment, it does not have that love and can become unstable very quickly. The Martians' attempt at controlling the world took place on one of the small islands in the west of Atlantis. This place today is known as the Bermuda Triangle. It's a triangle because the top of the stationary tetrahedron of the Merkaba is actually sticking out of the water there, which...
Okay, so not terribly important politically, however, we do have a heterotopic zone in the Bermuda Triangle where this experiment took place. So I guess the Bermuda Triangle is just Area X. Maybe it's because the technology developed further distorts our natural progression. Maybe the point is the churn of disruptive tech and less the subjugation. Well, the subjugation seems to have no concrete nature to it. It doesn't seem like they have to actually do anything to conquer the world. There's no, like, Jordan doesn't go into any detail as to what is required to conquer the world or to assert dominance over the Atlanteans. Just the Martians just occasionally take over for some reason, somehow. It's just a thing that happens even when they're already in charge, so not a whole lot to say there.
Which causes a huge electromagnetic imbalance in that area. Many planes and boats have reported to have gone missing there. They just vanish without a trace. The imbalance is multidimensional, and in many cases these ships and planes have been sucked into different dimensions, never to be seen again. That Merkaba is still there on the seafloor today, but from what I know, it's going to be corrected soon. The Nacals did their best to save Atlantis. They sent most of the lower dimensional beings back, at least as many as they could.
Okay, so this is actually quite interesting. Ruptures between universes are stable. They remain open over time. So it actually, maybe a heterotopic zone is incorrect. Well, I guess it would be in a certain respect. The Bermuda Triangle is a wormhole. Of sorts.
And sealed up the dimensional tear. Despite this, the situation got really bad, really fast. All of the economic systems collapsed. Financial, social, and all concepts of how life ought to be completely broke down. Everyone on Atlantis began getting sick with weird diseases, and the entire continent went into a state of survival. Life was no longer about living. It became about surviving until tomorrow. It was a literal hell on Earth. The Nacals had no idea what to do. They were children compared to the events that had been thrust upon them. So, they prayed. They prayed to the highest levels of conscious life in the universe, asking for help from anyone who could hear them. The problem was reviewed on many high levels of life, who I am drawing as the Justice League because the 11th and 12th dimensions are completely incomprehensible to us in our current state. What they told us was this: we were going to fall. We were going to hit rock bottom, level 1, the lowest place we possibly could be in the universe and still survive. Also, we were changing polarity. We were no longer a female species, so we were starting from square one as a male species. And finally, and this was the shocker, we would only have 13,000 years to return to Christ consciousness. Normally, it takes hundreds of thousands of years for a species to get to Christ consciousness. We had to do it in a fraction of the time. If we didn't, we would not survive. This has never happened before in the universe, ever. Thoth, who was the priest king of Atlantis at the time, learned that they would have to perform this experiment on themselves. They received instructions from the highest levels of life and they went on their way. Thoth proceeded with a being named Ra and Aragat, who were previous kings of Atlantis, and began the experiment. To understand what they did, we have to talk about consciousness grids. A planetary grid is an etheric crystalline structure that envelops the planet and holds the consciousness of any one species of life. This grid does have an electromagnetic component associated with the third dimension, but it also has a component for every dimension as well. These grids are geometric, of course, and science will eventually discover that there is a grid for every species in the world. Each of these grids have their own geometry and are unique. There's not another one like it, just as the species itself are unique. These grids give off light as well, and from space they can be seen as the source of the bluish glow around the Earth. What Thoth and friends had to do was create a synthetic Christ consciousness grid, allowing humans to ascend to Christ consciousness in a very short time. But first, let's talk about the science behind the grid. Perhaps you've heard of the 100th monkey experiment. Over a span of 30 years, scientists were researching a species of monkey called Macaca fuscata on an island in Japan. They were providing the monkeys with sweet potatoes by dropping them in the sand. The monkeys liked sweet potatoes, but they didn't like the sand and dirt so much. A few monkey children figured out that they could wash their sweet potatoes, and some of them taught the technique to their parents. Only a few of the adult monkeys did this though. This went on for some time until one day the monkeys who actually knew the technique hit critical mass. And bingo! The technique started spreading faster than it did before. Monkeys started learning it really easily across all of the Japanese islands nearby as well as on the mainland. They knew that there had to be something that wasn't yet understood.
Okay, so there's a weird kind of waffling here going on. I was all excited when he said consciousness grid. 'Cause, ooh, grid. Grid is a geometric, it's a plane on which you can draw spatial entities. We're doing a nomological analysis. It seems like it'd be really useful. But it goes immediately from being a grid with some kind of spatial principle associated with it to this is just a magic MacGuffin that causes us to increase our vibrations or something.
About how a species is connected to itself. So what did we do? We tried it on humans. Our research team made a picture out of human faces. About 100 faces hidden within a single picture, but at first glance, you could only see about 6 or 7. They did several surveys with a few hundred people in Australia and said, alright, find the faces. Most people could only pick out 6, 7, 8, 9 or so, not many more. After that, the research team went to Britain and aired the picture on a closed cable BBC special that was shown only in England. They showed where all of the faces were, every last one. Half of the research team, which stayed in Australia, did the experiment again with new subjects. And lo and behold, people were just naturally able to see more faces. After this experiment, they knew that something definitely connects us all, and the field of noetics is learning more about it daily. It's mass consciousness. In lesson 11, I showed you the 3 levels of consciousness. Each of these levels have their own consciousness grids around the planet, and our second level grid is based on squares and triangles. Many governments of the world, especially the Russian and US governments, were studying our grids back in the 60s and probably earlier. When mapping out the grid on the planet, you find little military bases on many of the nodal points of the grid. There are tons of these bases way out in the middle of nowhere, like on little islands like Guam. This couldn't be a coincidence that these government powers placed their bases right where the little spirals came out of the grid. They were trying to take control of the grid, because if you control consciousness, you control what we think and feel. Of course, there was another organization that had its hand in both of these governments, and still do, and we will discuss them soon enough.
Okay, so this is the same nodal system as before. So here's what's sort of interesting. By implication, if you control the grid, which is represented by the nodal system of sacred sites, if you control the major religious centers of the world, you control the human mind. Simplicator, all human minds. He who controls the pyramids / Tibet / Sunday school somewhere controls the universe.
This grid is visible through astral projection as well. 13,000 years ago, it began. Thoth, Ra, and Aragat were to create a global complex that was able to build a synthetic Christ consciousness grid over a 13,000-year time period. The first thing they did was to fly to a place which is now called the Giza Plateau, but back then it was known as the land of Chem. It was also a rainforest back then as well, not desert like it is today. First, they created a grid around the planet 4th dimensionally, and then began to construct it in the physical 3rd dimension. They went to the male energetic axis of the Earth and constructed a complex which today is called the Solar Cross. These men were 6th-dimensional beings at that time and were living at a very high level of consciousness, so whatever they thought happened instantly. It was that simple. According to Thoth, he built the Great Pyramid, not the Egyptian king Cheops. Thoth says that it was built 200 years prior to the pole shift and built very quickly. These pyramids were aligned precisely with both Fibonacci and golden mean spirals emanating from out of the solar cross. Interestingly enough, Edgar Cayce also channeled that the pyramids were constructed in this time. The pyramids were also found to be built from the top down. The stones on top were placed first, which has baffled researchers ever since. Every time more is learned about the pyramids, we move further into dark on understanding how they were formed. If what Thoth says is true, Well, that explains everything. From there, Thoth and friends constructed an entire network of temples and structures along this grid fourth dimensionally, placing them on nodes on the new synthetic Christ consciousness grid they were creating. All of them were made with Fibonacci or golden mean spirals, and all of them were mathematically referred back to the solar cross in Egypt through the Great Pyramid. The creation of all of the sacred sites on the planet were no accident. It was a single consciousness that created them all, from Machu Picchu to Stonehenge to Zaghuan, you name it. There are a few exceptions, but most were created by a single awareness as part of a unity consciousness grid. Although the Great Pyramid was done all at once, many of these ancient structures of the world were made fourth dimensionally and slowly dropped in frequency until they manifested on the third dimension over a long period of time. Richard Hoagland's research brings this forward, but he wasn't the first either. They showed how one sacred site is extrapolated from another to another to another. A hot topic of discussion right now are ley lines. These are simply geometric relations between sacred sites. Archaeologists are now finding these huge connections between major spiritual sites on the globe, and now we know why they're connected. These sites had to be built physically so that the Christ consciousness grid could manifest. In a way, think of the physical sites as the wiring of a giant wireless electrical system, and then it needs about 13,000 years of continuous energy flow for it to actually turn on. And just so that you're not left in suspense, yes, the grid was completed. It came to life and is now active, though not really used. Congratulations, Earth! We actually survived. Not only has Thoth told us this in person, but he's also written it down in the Emerald Tablets. These tablets were left in the Great Pyramid thousands of years ago. There are 12 tablets in total, formed from a substance created through alchemical transmutation. They are imperishable, resistant to all elements and corrosion. Their atomic structure is fixed in place, and no change can ever take place. In that respect, they violate the material laws of ionization. These tablets share a great wisdom, and you can read them at over 100 different levels of consciousness, and you will always understand them differently. If you're interested in this stuff, you should definitely consider reading them. As you can probably tell, Thoth plays a pretty large role in what happened. Most of this information comes from him. Thoth also provided most of this information about the flower of life and its geometric relationship to consciousness with us, and this stuff is tied intimately to the geometry of the universe. Considering the quality and quantity of information that he has shared, it makes you really start considering that this next part can be true. The Great Pyramid has a legendary missing capstone. According to the Emerald Tablets, deep under the Great Pyramid there's a room called the Hall of Records. This room was not built by Thoth and long predates the Atlantean civilization. Within the Hall of Records is the capstone of the pyramid, which is 5.5 inches high, solid gold, and completely holographic image of the Great Pyramid. It has all of the little rooms and everything. However, this leaves us with a 24 square foot piece of the Great Pyramid that's missing. If what Thoth says is true, that missing piece actually belongs to a very special airship that exists on Earth. And the way to the airship is through the Sphinx. The Sphinx, according to Thoth, is not 12,000 years old, but dates back over 5.5 million years on Earth. Deep under the Sphinx, about 1 mile down, is a round room with a flat floor and flat ceiling. Inside this room is the oldest synthetic object on Earth. The object is about 2 city blocks in size. It's round like a disc and has a flat bottom and top. It is also only about 3 atoms thick, except for a pattern on the top and bottom which looks like this. This pattern is 5 atoms thick. Thoth says that it's powered by consciousness, thoughts, and feelings, and connects with your own.
I'm just seeing how much longer this goes for. So we have the equinox, we have, what is this?
Have its own defense mechanism? This defense is an airship that plugs into the Earth and the Sun, allowing the Earth to have protection. Our takeover event actually already happened, the same year the Christ grid was activated. The year was 1989, and we were having some troubles with the Greys, a race of ETs who were slowly plotting takeover due to a previous scuffle we were having. A very pure woman in Peru made the ascension process into the Christ consciousness grid and found the ship. She tuned it to the frequency of the 4th dimension, where she raised it through the...
Alright, so apparently we have a disc thing that defends the Earth. There, that's a disc thing. And then we go... and that sort of looks like a disc thing. And then we go... Then... Oh, no, do it like that. Yeah, there we go. The disc of power. Alright. Disc of Thoth or something. Disc interacts with sun and defends the planet, I will assume, effectively. Sorry to jump a little bit, just I'm realizing this has 30 more minutes to go.
The earth and into the air, and manifested a situation for the Greys to leave. Within a very short time, the Greys began getting sick, and remained sick for as long as they stayed here. They have been forced to leave for now, and we are once again safe. The ship is a warship in that whatever race is trying to take over, the person will just think them away, think up a situation, and force them to leave. Returning to the events on Atlantis, after completing the complex in Egypt, Thoth and pals returned to Atlantis where they waited for about 200 years until that critical point on the precession of the equinox where the poles would shift. They knew that Atlantis would sink, and they would be ready.
Previously on Thoth and Pals.
Thoth, the poles are shifting.
Oh, the pole shift?
Yeah, whoa, what's wrong with your eyes?
I don't know.
When Thoth first saw signs of the polar shift, they returned to the land of Chem and raised the warship into the sky. They went to Atlantis and picked up the Nakals. The Nakals weren't just passengers though, and each and every being was working in unity to create a very powerful Merkaba around themselves and the ship. They returned to the Great Pyramid and landed the ship on top, forming the phi ratio with the pyramid. And then, it happened. The poles began to shift, and human consciousness began to plummet. Simultaneously, the electromagnetic and magnetic fields of the Earth collapsed, and all life on the planet went into the Great Void, the 3.5 days of absolute blackness described by many ancient cultures in the world. The Emerald Tablets say that whenever we go through a polar shift, we go through a void space as we change our frequencies for about 3.5 days. This is also in the Troano document, depicted by 3.5 stones painted black. This refers to a time when we go through what science calls the electromagnetic null zone. During the pole shift, a phenomenon takes place where everything just seems to disappear for a certain time. Usually it's between 2 to 4 days, and the last time it was 3.5 days. Here's where it gets interesting. What happens to us does not usually happen to a normal species, because most advanced species will have their Merkabas handy at the time of the shift. We didn't, due to our little crisis, and we got sucked into the void space without protection. This resulted in us losing our memories. Science realizes that all of our memories are connected through cells in our brains as well as fields around our heads. What is not entirely understood by science yet, at least not directly, is the connection our memories have with the planet itself. We've discussed this before. The magnetics of the Earth affect how we think and act. The Merkaba is an electromagnetic field that you create around your body that can serve as protection from void as you're consciously going through it. What happened to us when we didn't have that protection? It was a clean wipe. When we existed on Atlantis, we were living at a very high level of consciousness in a higher dimension. We had extremely advanced and sophisticated bodies and minds, and were capable of practically anything, living in a dimension where molecules were spaced so far apart that consciousness could interact with them without physically moving. It's hard to explain because you can literally shape your environment immediately through your consciousness in these higher frequencies. In that sense, we were creators, knowing and understanding oneness, beings of love. But then we fell. We dropped back down to this place called the third dimension. We also fell in consciousness back to zero. We forgot how to use the pineal gland, and it slowly shrunk to the size it is now, like a raisin, where it's supposed to be eyeball size. When this happened, we forgot how to breathe source energy into our bodies, and our lifespans went kaput. Eventually, we went from 900 years to what it is today. We had not experienced this dense reality that we had before, at least for a very long time.
I'm just gonna jump ahead a little bit. My brain is melting. It's not even that it's nonsense, it's that no sentence actually leads into the one that follows it.
It is your soul's physical aspect. What we are seeing in DNA is changes in the codon. No archaeologist can explain how this happened or explain how it could have happened. They placed Egypt and Sumer into a special classification, but at the last minute they asked for an extra 1.5 million under the table. Paramount was outraged and they backed off. Things were silent for about 3 months. Then, Drunvalo heard from his source again, who was involved in all this, This event, perhaps less exaggerated than the myths, actually did happen, and it took place on Atlantis. Osiris's wife and sister retrieved the pieces, and upon returning the final piece, they restored the creative energy flow and brought his spirit back into the body. Through doing this, Osiris became immortal, and he was the first immortal.
Okay, so I think we just descended into madness at this point. Let's actually try and do this now. Okay. Mother of God. That was... I had only seen the Armored Skeptic reviews of that. I didn't realize it was that long. Oh my god. Alright. Alright, so... Okay, so let's break this down. So we have universe bubbles, right? Here, let's cordon this off from the rest of the encyclopedia. The encyclopedia. Like that. The Nomos of the encyclopedia. So we have universe bubbles that are rupturable. There are many such universe bubbles. They have different qualities. Now we can extrapolate from this that the elevation of land isn't the only thing that's tied to consciousness levels. Physicality generally is tied to consciousness levels. So, in the last clip before we finished off, Jordan was, or Patch Guy was indicating that the level of material density in a universe is determinative of whether or not you can manipulate matter with your mind. Irrelevant. I think the important point is that there is a duality between left and right brain thinking. Right brain thinking is sort of related to this strange conception of the Christ character and femininity and love and whatnot. Right brain thinking, or sorry, did I mix those up? That's right brain thinking. Left brain thinking is associated with masculinity and violence, presumably, and other specific forms of technology. And these things are infectious because if a highly left-brained being interacts with a right-brained being, even if it's defeated by it, its left-brain thinking will somehow infect the right-brain thinking being. And so these are rupturable by apparently using a synthetic Merkaba, which is apparently identical in some respect with the very barrier of these universe bubbles. It can be used to penetrate another world bubble, at which point it infects it with its own qualities, or more accurately, they sort of equal out between each other. If that makes sense. Alright. So, in grand scheme of things, we have apparently a sort of limitless field of play with innumerable of these universe bubbles that can all be penetrated by means of somehow using a Merkaba to break the seal between worlds. However, there are downsides to this. If you do so recklessly, apparently, you can break worlds unintentionally. Let's decolor this, because apparently that made that invisible. You can accidentally, and I'm going to assume we can represent it directionally, if you lose control, you can rupture, or I wonder actually. Okay, so he talks about lower dimensions. So I take these to mean sort of like subhuman spirits of some kind, right? So you can, if you lose control, you can rupture these ones, and these actually must be, in some respect, which doesn't actually make any sense, bordering on each other. And why must they be bordering on each other? Because when Okay, so it must have to do with the elevation of the consciousness between the different dimensions, because the Martians, of course, invade our universe, but they don't bleed in, they come over consciously. However, when they do the Lucifer experiment and something goes wrong, this lower dimension here, it sort of bleeds into the other universe. And that's why we all have bad feels, I suppose, and Scientology. And apparently, such a rift is still in existence at the bottom of the sea and the Bermuda Triangle. So that seems like it should be important. So that's at one level. We have these universe bubbles. They They appear to have some ontic connection with consciousness. Yeah, okay, so planets. Within these universe bubbles, we have planets. Let's draw Earth here. And let's zoom in a little bit. And the planet has a Kundalini spirit inside of it. Nice pink Kundalini spirit here. And the Kundalini spirit can interact with the planet's exterior by means of these nodes, which can be represented by a grid, which I will make quickly right now. So, do that, and we do that. This is the most efficient way to make an accurate grid. Watch and learn from the technical master. And babushki. Alright, and now we take that, which is that color. Yes, very good. Very good. And we take this grid and we transpose it over. Now we have our Kundalini grid. Or our, what did we call it? Some kind of consciousness grid. It's a grid, that's all you need to know. It's a grid. It's an important grid. It's a magic grid. On this grid are nodes. And these nodes are sacred sites. So right here, in this horribly scribbled dot, that might be Africa, and there might be a thing that looks sort of like this. That is not the color I wanted. That is the color I wanted. And there are many such nodes. However, the Kundalini can only target one at a time. So maybe somewhere over here we have, I don't know, Catholic mystics or something. Jordan's a New Age guy. He's not going to find this. It's agreeable. Maybe at one point they had a level of spirituality and they were like the leaders for a long period of time. However, they lost their link to the Kundalini because the Kundalini can only connect with one node at a time. So maybe it's zapping the Great Pyramids. Alright. And when it zaps a location, it opens up a subsidiary grid. Like that. Yeah, that's the grid. Alright. And solid color. Okay. That's not a grid, but this will work. And then in this grid, there are other nodes, smaller nodes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And for whatever reason, this big pink heart thing, the Kundalini absolutely needs intelligent life forms to occupy settled spaces on these nodes. Why? I don't know. But it pulls them in, apparently. And cities are always built over them, except when they're not. And I suppose there's some strange recognition on the part of other species that these small nodes are important. I think. For some reason. Okay, let's think really hard. Let's think really hard. What are the stakes here? Who are the players and what are the stakes? What are the things people want? Well, supposedly, despite the fact that there is apparently a one-to-one relationship between the Kundalini spirit and our spirituality, such that where it orients itself is where we ascend spiritually. At the same time, we can sort of kill it like they do in Avatar by having really, really bad consciousness or something. So, if that happens, I guess your planet will be destroyed, except it also seems, so if the Kundalini spirit dies, your planet gets destroyed, but it only gets destroyed because of the activities of the beings that killed the Kundalini spirit somehow. Okay. And then they recognize that they need one, so they are able to create a synthetic Merkaba, which is also apparently it's a manifestation of their souls, because they still have souls, presumably. And then, I guess, for some reason they want to control the Kundalini of another planet. Why? I guess they just, it's their male left brains. They're just compelled to dominate and control everything. So presumably this Kundalini has such a central relation to human consciousness, therefore it plays a central role in controlling, period. It's the weirdest thing, because there are so many different elements to this, but it's all so flat. Like, it's so flat, it's difficult to talk about. There are just these geometric shapes, which is what we want. We are doing a nomological analysis. We want geometric shapes. Geometric shapes, very good. But they have no determinate significance or value. We're just sort of told, this thing is important because this thing is important, because this thing is important, because this thing is important. And they're just throwing words. Like he'll just say things. He'll say, Merkaba is also your soul, and it's also your spirit, and spirit is God, and it's like, okay. Okay. Why does it matter? But to stay on point, this is actually super simplistic. This is super simplistic. This is super easy to actually conceptualize. So basically, we have a hunger in this universe. We have a drive to connect with a living soul within a planet somewhere. And we have a mechanism for doing so, and that is occupying specific spaces on a nodal grid related to that soul. Okay, and so the contest becomes who can control these nodal spaces. And they control the nodal spaces apparently by we don't know. Well, I mean, supposedly by settling one of the subnodes in this subgrid here. I don't know why there is a grid. I don't know why the grid subdivides into a smaller grid with 10 specific spaces when the Kundalini interacts with one node. I don't know what causes the nodes to change, except some vague reference to a polar shift. it seems to be kind of a back and forth. You would expect there to be either a unidirectional, you expect a unidirectional relationship between matter and consciousness if there is a direct relationship between them. It would be matter determines consciousness or consciousness determines matter. This seems to waffle between the two, where the Kundalini can be determinant of our own spirituality, and yet our own spirituality can be determinant of the Kundalini, which means that neither of these have any explanatory value. It's just kind of chaos. And okay. All right, so I guess in this Nomos, the universe is divided into different species that are hungry for interaction with a Kundalini spirit of some kind. However, that hunger for a Kundalini spirit is also what specifically destroys a Kundalini spirit. And so, extraterrestrials that are at a lower level, or at more accurately, more of a left brain mode of consciousness, become like an infectious disease that destroys every planet they come into contact with, or every world they come into contact with slowly. And then but then he interjects like higher dimensional beings that he can't describe or explain. Basically gods who just sort of change things. And that's when it starts being apolitical, because you can't have a political state of affairs in which you have sort of extrinsic oughts being imposed from outside that have force. Because it ceases then to be a political situation. Now it's, I don't know what you would call it. It becomes like think of it in terms of chess, right? Chess is a game with rules. When you play it with someone, the end isn't determined. You are playing and interacting with each other to try and gain control of squares. If you wanted to talk about the nomos of a chessboard, you would identify it by reference specifically to its squares. It's like, well, the world is comprised of squares that you want to control in a particular way, with the aim of preventing the opponent from moving on to those squares or from getting into proximity to your king, and vice versa. Makes sense. We sort of have that here if there was only one square. Or more accurately, if we could only occupy one square at a time. I think that's maybe the way to look at it. It's a game of chess in which every piece is a king, and every piece is on a different side. And if you move, you end the game for someone definitionally. Except this game of chess has a game master, and they're throwing in plot elements saying, no, you can't do that, a wizard appeared, things like that. So it ceases at that point to be political. But until you bring in the really supernatural elements, until you bring in superhuman agencies that sort of artificially determine what the appropriate outcomes are, or what the appropriate actions are on the part of every player. Because again, like as soon as you have external forces telling both sides in the conflict to to go along with a certain plan that is not in the interest of either or, it ceases to be a political game, because now they're all on side in a way. We're no longer talking about autonomous communities in conflict with each other. Now we're talking about a big household in which rambunctious children are being told to stand in the corner or something. So, I mean, ironically enough, it's an incredibly one-dimensional story he's been spinning. Because he'll make reference to multiple dimensions, but they're just rooms in the same, that abide by the same rules. Every single one of these dimensional things, they are described in the terms of our world, unless he simply refuses to describe them and says they aren't. And we have to give him the benefit of the doubt then. I mean, we don't, but for argument's sake, what we're doing here, we have to. I'm going to let this run for a little bit longer. I'm going to grab some water, and we'll see if we can't salvage this. I'm going to go back to where we left off. I'll be back in a moment.
Great missing capstone. According to the Emerald Tablets, deep under the Great Pyramid there's a room called the Hall of Records. This room was not built by Thoth and long predates the Atlantean civilization. Within the Hall of Records is the capstone of the pyramid, which is 5.5 inches high, solid gold, and completely holographic image of the Great Pyramid. It has all of the little rooms and everything. However, this leaves us with a 24 square foot piece of the Great Pyramid that's missing. If what Thoth says is true, that missing piece actually belongs to a very special airship that exists on Earth. And the way to the airship is through the Sphinx. The Sphinx, according to Thoth, is not 12,000 years old, but dates back over 5.5 million years on Earth. Deep under the Sphinx, about 1 mile down, is a round room with a flat floor and flat ceiling. Inside this room is the oldest synthetic object on Earth. The object is about 2 city blocks in size. It's round like a disc and has a flat bottom and top. It is also only about 3 atoms thick, except for a pattern on the top and bottom which looks like this. This pattern is 5 atoms thick. Thoth says that it's powered by consciousness, thoughts, and feelings, and connects with your own living Merkaba, which means that it becomes an extension of you and your own energy fields. The ship is also intimately connected with the spirit of the Earth, and is the protector for the whole planet. Thoth built the pyramid the way he did to fit with the ship. When on top of the Great Pyramid, it creates this image from above. The disc ship has a circumference equal to the perimeter of the Great Pyramid. As we discussed in Lesson 11, whenever that ratio appears, life occurs. This ship can only be used by the purest of souls. See, whenever we approach the point in the precession of the equinox where our poles do these shifts, we become very vulnerable. Things often degenerate, and while things become chaotic, there are often other species who wish to take us over. This has always happened, not just with us, but with all evolving consciousness. Every time a takeover seems imminent, a very pure person will find their way to the ship and...
Okay, screw that garbage. This is interesting, though. Okay, so time is now an element here. So pole shifts are what are responsible for the degeneration of pure-souled universes into impure-souled universes. And this is what makes them vulnerable and desirable as objects, as targets for attack from other universes that presumably have already suffered pole shifts. So this presents a bit of a problem because it, well, does it? I mean, it all presents a problem. But I suppose... Okay. Alright, so one of these universes are going to have... let's represent this by a positive and negative. Negative... Well, let's make that bigger. That 150. Yeah, there we go. Positive. Okay. So, every so often, there is a pole shift. And that happens, I suppose. And when that happens, all of a sudden, we start going crazy. Okay. So we go crazy from the pole shift. That disorders the world in such a way that there now become, I suppose, exposed, unused nodes in our universe, out of which Kundalini energy bleeds, and that attracts aliens from elsewhere whose Kundalinis are dead. They're hungry for a world soul of some kind, and they invade. Spudlord says, this gives me Spengler vibes, the whole degenerate society falling into the hands of the strong, outstanding leader. There is something to that. I might actually cover that in another video at some point. I'm a little bit fuzzy on it at this point to go into it, but there is overlap between that sort of thinking and this. I mean, if you think about it, and this is what's sort of interesting. When we're talking about the planet thing here, with its own little grid, this is meaningless. This is a weird, trivial invention that he has. It may as well be... It's as trivial as the stupid disc ship, right? But this sort of totalizing conception of a world as being something that has a thin, concrete distinction between inside and outside, that is constantly vulnerable to invasion from other such enclosed world entities. That is super consonant with the modern concept of the nation state. You can really easily translate that over. You're missing a lot of stuff. Like, this is really stupid, but there are commonalities there. There's nothing to that. Fake name says, maybe that's why modern tech is contaminating. The magnetic interference of modern tech has an influence on these fields. We experiment on magnetic force to influence our evolution towards the next step. Well, maybe. But here's what we come to. The big conclusion. This was horrible, guys. The big conclusion. The world is comprised of world bubbles that can be penetrated at specific nodes by harnessing energy that can only be accessed at those nodes. That's it. That's the rich world of spirit science. That's what he gives you. A grid. It's just a grid. It's like, what's that game called? It's a big game of Go. Which is interesting, I guess. A bit. I mean, he goes about it in an interesting way. But none of this stuff means anything. Like, he uses all this highfalutin language, like the Kundalini is a spirit. It's mind, it's God. Or your Merkaba is mind / God, what have you. But it gets reduced to, like, a battery. The Kundalini is a battery. It's what sort of powers cities. Your Merkaba, your soul, is a frickin' jetpack. Why does the polarity shift affect humans? I have no idea. We gotta go to the Sphinx. Like, when, like, so here's where this is kind of weird for me. So I'm actually in the server right now, and if you're not there, you should join. Join the Cathedral. There should be a link in the description. We're reading the Phenomenology of Spirit right now. And in the context of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, spirit refers to consciousness itself. And not in a woo-woo way. He's doing something very specific. If in Kant's epistemology, there is sort of an unbreakable divide between things as they actually are and our perceptions of those things, or rather the representations of those things to our consciousness, consciousness. That's it, consciousness. If there is an unbreakable divide, we cannot actually reach at the thing in itself, because all we see are representations representations along the axes of space and time, right? So you distinguish between objects spatially, and you conceive of them over time. So when you have a thought, you think about things that can be represented spatially, and the thought, of course, runs in a sentence. This, then this, therefore this. Time. To move from one item of consciousness to the next, or from one object to the next, you need time. If these are principles of our minds and not of the world, time and space, if these are simply the modes in which we experience things, then definitionally every experience we have is just going to be some kind of representation of a thing out there whose true identity we can't access consciously. What Hegel's going to do, and I'm not an expert, so I'm probably going to botch this a little bit, but what Hegel's going to do is he's going to say, well, hold on a second. You've inferred that stuff out there in the first place in relation to your consciousness. Therefore, it's not entirely appropriate to deprioritize your experience of, to demote your experience or your perceptions of objects from the objects themselves. You do have some point of contact. Consciousness, spirit, self-awareness does have some point of contact with the world. As it actually is, not simply in our minds. So he criticizes Kant for being sort of one-sided and formalistic. He gets it right. It's true that there are things out there that we can't experience in a direct way as things in themselves, because of course beneath the surface of things is not something that can appear to us. We see only the surface of things definitionally. But nonetheless, we can still think those things, and in thinking those things, we bring them into our consciousness. And so what happens is, instead of, it's not so much that he refutes Kant, but he undoes Kant's demotion of the experience vis-a-vis the things in themselves, right? And so Hegel Hegel links consciousness to ontology in that way, and as we become more and more aware of the world, of our place in the world, of our proper place in the world, of what we want to be vis-a-vis what we are, things like that, as we gain more scientific knowledge, we ascend, quote unquote, in spirit until we attain absolute spirit, absolute knowledge of the world and our place in it. We attain to essentially a godlike consciousness in the world. The universe becomes conscious of itself. I've botched that, I'm sure. But the point is, what Jordan is saying here when he says spirit is magical zappy things that float around your head, because that makes your mind better somehow. Your world is richer if there are imaginary zappy zaps floating around your skull, because it's just not the same without them. It's just not. You, a half-wit without a grid is only half a half-wit. Unless you're William Blake, then things get a bit weird. Oh, things are weird either way. Life is weird. So, that was a thing. That was definitely a thing. Was it worth it? Eh. Hebrews travel through time. Why? Okay, here's something a little bit mean-spirited. Did you guys notice all of the spelling errors throughout the whole thing? And like how he couldn't switch from talking about a singular to a plural. So he would talk about two places, Ohio and Wisconsin, say. He would say, Ohio and Wisconsin is something. Like, he wrote a script for this, right? He animated it. He must have recorded multiple times. This didn't click in. Jordan's a bit of a dum-dum. Oh, and if that seems mean, let's actually look that up quickly while we're here. Let's torch the guy a little bit, because he is actually a rapist, unambiguously. Hang on, I need some water. Alright, sorry about that. I could feel a catch in my throat like I was about to have a cough explosion. Let me find this quickly, because this is actually, it's interesting in a dismal sort of way. Jordan, Spirit, Science, Rapist.
Expression that Emma is the Christ Sophia was to honor the light with...
Okay, hang on, that's not it. There's a clip where he gives an apology. Let me see if I can find the Reddit page. Oh, it seems like it's been deleted. How convenient. How convenient. Maybe this is it. Oh, what's this? Some kind of call. Okay, so this is interesting. Jordan Duknich, the creator of Spirit Science, coercively raped a woman in 2012. 2 pretext calls were made in cooperation with Portland police. In these conversations, Jordan admits to his crimes. This video portions of the first transcript call from February 7th, 2017. Okay, let's, so that won't do because I'm logged in by name there. Let's try clicking on this again. Yeah, here we go. Alright. Let's look at this. Oh, that's sort of cut off there, isn't it? Let's fix that. Fake name, thank you very much for the $14. That's $14.99. That's very generous of you, thank you. Here we go. So we need to, I'm just going to edit this quickly so you can actually see it. Let's do like 300 that way, and 200 that way. That was 515 before. Alright. So, hopefully this won't make me have to delete the video after all that. Oh, and here, there's more information here. Right. Jordan Duknich and Brock Turner defining rape in America. So Duknich approached his victim as she laid alone in a room. In the pretext call, she states, "I didn't want to be touched, I didn't want to talk to anyone, I wanted to be alone." Duknich didn't listen. In a pretext call recorded in cooperation with the Portland Police Department, he admits that he forced her head to face his, uncrossed her arms from her chest, removed clothing from both their bodies, and began kissing various parts of their head, torso, etc. He then had sex with her while she was resisting and crying, apparently. In the second pretext call, he admits to raping her. Okay, so that's interesting. So we actually have a confession here. So let's listen to this.
I don't know, I just want to understand why. Like, I just want to be able to put the past behind us, behind this, and move forward, you know?
Yeah.
I just need to understand. And I know we've kind of talked about this before in those, on Facebook.
Speed this up a bit, if we can. No, we can't. Okay, that's fine.
And I was so scared.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Would you be able and willing to come down to Arizona and see me when I'm down there?
I don't know, because this is, the whole reason why, I haven't been able to talk to you in years.
I mean, on a purely, if it's just the logic of understanding, there's a combination of things, but the alchemical ingredients for what happened were really, one, how old was I, 20? A 20-year-old boy who is overcome with desire for the most beautiful woman that he's ever met, I don't know if you know, because you've not experienced this, at least in this lifetime, but that particular age for men is they're just hormone sex machines. That's the only thing that's on their mind.
But Jordan, I said no.
Jordan, I know, and I'm trying to answer your question. I'm trying to explain how we got here from my understanding. And this is and it really did come from love. And I know that that's not, it wasn't right. Clearly, as the results have demonstrated. But the state that I was in was that I wanted to love you and I wanted to be loved by you. And I was completely overcome with lust. And that's entirely on me. And the part of it that's yours is that, yes, I asked a million times, And yes, you said no a million times. But at one point, you said yes. And that's what led to it happening. And if you can own that part of it, then it might become a lot easier to move forward with, is accepting that you did agree to it in the end. And
I was
even
crying
if
the
you,
whole time.
I didn't know what you were crying about.
You didn't
I
know.
thought there was something else bothering you because you were, look, I don't know.
But you
all I-
remember me
all-
crying. Don't you think that was like a bad time? Like I didn't really have I didn't have good judgment. Don't
I
you
didn't
think you
either.
should have stopped if I was crying?
I wish that I could have.
You
and
just
looking
kept
back
going.
at the wish that
Just kept going until you finished.
I'm sorry.
You know you
There's-
did. You know,
So yeah, fuck this guy. And he got away with it. This was in 2017. And yeah. See, in Oregon, they're cool with it if you have sex with someone when they say no and they're bawling their eyes out. Oh yeah, laugh at his spelling, laugh at his disgusting little beard. Grotesque little creature. By the way, this happens all the time. This is not unique to this guy. Not a bit. This happens in academia all the time. I mean, the 1 in 3 number is probably difficult to verify, but I would not feel that in danger if I were to bet money on it being something like 1 in 10. Could very well be 1 in 3. I think the link is only on Facebook for a reason. I think the link is on Facebook because, well, I mean, you think Facebook wouldn't delete this kind of thing? This has been on Facebook now since 2017. If YouTube deletes this stream, that's fine, I don't care. But, yeah. So, that's a nice, happy note to end this on, isn't it? At some point this week, I'm going to be releasing the first of the Patron videos. That's going to be on the use and abuse of BreadTube. And I'm going to be talking about specifically what good actually is the online left for things like online activism, for making an actual impact on politics. And there is a way in which it is, I think, but it's complicated. And then on Saturday we have the next of the Sunday Showdown debates that will be between Dilvani the Goddess, who is a friend of the channel and a very, very smart person, and fellow traveler. And that will be concerning the question of whether or not a market or a planned economy is preferable. And then on Sunday, at some point, I believe in the morning, I will be appearing again with Victor Mangarino. Mangarino. I'm going to get that name right at some point. He says he's fine with Victor Mangarino, but I really want to get the pronunciation on. he is going to appear with me to discuss some video of cosmic skeptics. I'm not 100% sure which one it is yet, but he's always fun to talk to, so that'll be interesting. And then we are still looking for people to take part in debates in the future. Our philosophy here is we really want to promote smaller to medium-sized channels, and by medium-sized I mean like the 5K range on the high end, preferably. We'll take higher people, of course, because that helps everyone, but ideally the goal is to network serious thinkers that are having trouble getting a large audience size. Now, of course, we don't have a large audience size. We're about 2,030 at the moment, but that's the goal. So, if you or anyone you know is interested in serious, they care about a topic, and they want to take part in a well-moderated, I think, discussion concerning that topic, reach out to me on Twitter or Discord. The Discord link is open in the description. We have a really interesting community there that's growing. I highly recommend it. This Sunday, before my stream with Victor, we'll be resuming after a long hiatus our weekly reading group on the phenomenology of spirit. Yeah, there's a lot of really smart, really intelligent, really interesting people there. I highly recommend it. And I think that's it for announcements. So, Fake Name says, President Sunday, I find this interesting, but you might want to edit that part out of the video if you post. I think the fact... Right, just a heads up, the strike system on this is easier. I mean, it is. At the same time, I've seen other videos on this on YouTube. In fact, while we're on it, he himself has a video covering this, called, as you can see, it's cut off again, isn't it? Transform. Let's do 150, 100. There we go. Let's do 300. Nope, 400. As you can... Oh, that's too much. As you can see, he himself is covering this topic on his channel as well. A story of rape and regret. I mean, this definitely makes this video not suitable for advertisements, but that's fine. Yeah, so that's a despicable creature. And now I have spirit, science, and rape in my YouTube history. Thank you for that. Well, that about does it, I think. I guess that ended on a heavier note than I was planning, but, well, that's the subject matter. Yeah, and the worst people are spirit science fans, because they're aware of this. Look, let's actually look at this again for a second. Maybe you'll see my comment cussing him out into here. I can't remember if I made one. Like, look at this. You heard the clip. He acknowledges, yeah, you were saying no, you were crying, you were resisting, but one time you said, maybe, and that was okay. Then while she was crying, you went on with it anyways. Look at this. First off, congratulations on sharing yourself vulnerably. Sometimes things don't heal without light exposing them. I think it is important to honor that Emma has been the Christ. What the hell is this? People are... Thank you for being the love and the light of this world, Jordan. Imagine valuing your dopamine hit from this so badly. Imagine being that shallow that this is what you'll put up with to keep on getting it. So, I mean, Jordan is a disgusting animal, is barely human, but these people These people are guilty in the extreme to my mind. It takes guts to be so open. Like, this is actually just evil. Yeah, he is a call leader. So. One more thing Canada has to apologize for. Well, I think that about wraps it up then. As always, thank you for listening and do take care. I guess you're watching now, aren't you? Thank you for putting up with my ugly mug. Do take care. Ciao.